It's about to get interesting, so subscribe and hit like so you don't miss the top content.
I sat at a table in the corner of the restaurant watching them. My gaze was fixed on her face, on her smile, on the way she laughed at his jokes. I knew this wasn't just a dinner between coworkers or friends. I knew there was something between them, and I had known that for a long time. But today I decided that I wasn't going to keep quiet anymore. Today, I decided that things were going to change. The restaurant was one of the places we used to go together when things first started. It was our place then. Now it was their place. I sat in the shadows ordering myself a glass of wine so as not to attract attention. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep my cool. In the pocket of my jacket was my wedding ring, the same ring I'd put on her finger years ago when we'd sworn eternal love to each other. It felt so heavy now, as if it held the weight of our mistakes, our pain, and our disappointment. I watched her fix her hair, her eyes glistening as she looked at him. He was handsome, confident, and I understood why she'd chosen him. But that didn't make the pain any less acute. I could feel the anger and despair fighting inside me, but I knew I had to stay cool. Today, I didn't just want to prove a point. Today, I wanted her to realize what she had lost. I caught the waiter's eye and nodded to him. He walked over to their table holding a small box. I saw her raise her eyebrows in surprise when the waiter placed the box in front of her. She opened it, and I saw her face change. First bewilderment, then shock, and then fear. She looked around, searching for me. I didn't bother to hide. I stepped out of the shadows and approached their table. She looked at me as if she had seen a ghost. He, on the other hand, looked confused, not realizing what was going on. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her, watched her hold our ring, the symbol of our promises that she had broken so easily. I watched her lips quiver as she tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. I turned and walked out of the restaurant. I didn't want to hear her excuses. I didn't want to see her trying to explain something that couldn't be explained. I walked outside where the night air was cool and crisp. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood pounding in my temples. I knew this was just the beginning. I knew that tomorrow everything would change. But in that moment, the only thing I felt was relief. Relief that I had finally done it. Relief that I wouldn't have to live a lie anymore. I got in the car and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, I saw her run out of the restaurant, still holding the ring. She yelled something, but I wouldn't listen. I hit the gas and drove off, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, alone, with our past in her hands. I drove through the deserted streets, not knowing exactly where I was going. The city was lit with lights, but my mind was dark. My hand clutched the steering wheel and my thoughts tangled like a tangle of thread that couldn't be untangled. I didn't cry. There were no more tears. There was only an emptiness that slowly filled me like water in a sinking ship. I couldn't go home. Everything there reminded me of her. The pictures on the walls, her perfume in the bathroom, her books on the shelf. Our house was no longer ours. It had become a museum where every exhibit told a story that had ended. I turned onto the highway, increasing my speed. The car roared as if it shared my rage and pain. I drove without purpose, just to keep moving, not to stop, because stopping meant being alone with myself, and I wasn't ready for that. After an hour, I was on the outskirts of town, where the lights became less frequent and the road narrower. I stopped in a deserted parking lot by a small lake. The water was black as ink and reflected the moon that hung in the sky, cold and indifferent. I got out of the car and walked to the shore. The wind blew in my face and I closed my eyes, trying to calm down, but everything was boiling inside. I pulled out my phone and looked at the screen. There wasn't a single text, not a single call. She hadn't even tried to contact me. That hurt the most. Not her cheating, not her lies, but this indifference. It was like I didn't matter anymore, as if everything between us could just be thrown away like an old thing that was no longer needed. I sat down on the cold sand and stared at the water. Memories flashed through my mind. Our first meeting, our first kiss, the day I proposed to her. She cried then, saying it was the happiest day of her life. And now she was sitting with him, laughing, enjoying his company, and here I was, alone, heartbroken, and empty-handed. I didn't know what to do next. The life I had built over the years had crumbled in an instant. I felt like I had been thrown over the side of a ship and was floating in the open ocean, not knowing where to go or if there was even a shore. But deep down, I knew I couldn't just give up. I couldn't let her destroy me completely. I stood up and walked back to the car. The wind had gotten stronger and I could feel the raindrops falling on my face. I got behind the wheel and started the engine again. This time I knew where I was going. I was going to a friend's house, the only person I could trust. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to explain. I just wanted to be near someone who wouldn't betray me. The drive took about an hour. When I pulled up to his house, the lights in the windows were still on. I knocked on the door and he opened it, seeing my face, immediately realizing something was wrong. He didn't ask any questions. He just hugged me, and in that moment I felt something inside me break. I didn't cry, but I felt all the pain, all the anger, and all the resentment come rushing out. We sat in the kitchen, and I finally told him everything. About how I'd suspected her for months, how I'd followed her, how I'd found proof. About how I'd decided to make that play at the restaurant so she'd realize I knew. He listened in silence, not interrupting, and when I finished, he simply said, "You deserve better than that." Those words stuck in my head. I deserve more. But what does that mean? What am I supposed to do now? Start a new life? Find someone else? Or just move on, trying to forget what happened? I didn't know the answers, but I did know one thing. I didn't want to be who I was anymore. I no longer wanted to be the man who lived a life of lies and betrayal. I stayed at a friend's house for the night. In the morning, I woke up with a heavy head, but with a clear decision. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I wouldn't let it ruin me. I would go home, pack my things, and start over. She can keep the ring, the house, the memories. I'll keep my life. And I'll do whatever it takes to make it better than it was. The morning greeted me with cold light filtering through the curtains in my friend's living room. I lay on the couch, covered in an old plaid, and stared up at the ceiling. The thoughts that had been swirling around in my head all night were finally starting to settle into some sort of structure. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Sooner or later, I would have to go back to our now my home and deal with what was left of our life together. I got up, rolled up the plaid, and went into the kitchen. My friend was already there making coffee. He nodded silently at me, realizing that I didn't feel like talking. We sat at the table drinking a hot drink, and I felt his support, even without words, giving me strength. After breakfast, I thanked him and told him it was time to go. He hugged me goodbye and said, "Call me if you need anything. I'm always here for you." The drive home seemed shorter than usual, probably because I was driving on autopilot, not thinking about anything but what lay ahead. As I pulled up to the house, my heart raced again. This place that had once been my fortress now seemed foreign. I grabbed my keys, took a deep breath, and walked in. It was quiet inside. She hadn't returned. I made my way to the living room, where there were still pictures of us on the table. I picked up one of them. Us on the beach, laughing, happy. It had been a long time ago. A long time ago. I put the picture back down and started packing my things. I didn't know where I would move to, but I realized I couldn't stay here. Every room, every corner of the house reminded me of her, of us, of what we had lost. I grabbed my bag and started putting the essentials in it. Clothes, papers, laptop. In the bedroom, I stopped at the closet. Her things were still hanging next to mine. I took my own clothes, leaving her dresses, sweaters, shoes. Let her take them herself. I didn't want anything that reminded me of her. When I was done, I sat on the bed and looked around the room. This was the last place we'd ever been together. The last place I'd felt happy. Now it was empty, and so was I. I grabbed my bag and left the room without looking back. In the living room, I noticed an envelope on the table. It had my name on it. I opened it and saw the letter, her handwriting. I didn't want to read it, but something made me unfold the sheet. She wrote about how sorry she was, how things had gotten out of hand, how she never meant to hurt me. She was asking for forgiveness, but those words didn't mean anything anymore. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. There would be no forgiveness, not now. Maybe never. I walked out of the house, closed the door, and got in my car. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew it was the start of something new. I turned on the radio, and the song that was playing seemed ironically fitting about how life goes on, even when it seems like it's over. I smiled for the first time in a long time. Perhaps it was a sign. I checked into a motel on the outskirts of town. It was a temporary solution, but I needed time to think to gather my thoughts. I checked in, walked into the room, and set my bag on the floor. The room was small but clean. It was everything I needed. I sat down on the bed and pulled out my phone. There were still no messages on the screen. I opened my contact list and found my lawyer's number. I knew the next step was divorce. I didn't want to drag out the process. I wanted to end it as soon as possible so I could start a new chapter of my life. I called the attorney, explained the situation, and made an appointment. He said he would help me sort everything out. I felt a little relieved. At least that much I could be sure of. In the evening, I left the room and went for a walk. The air was fresh, and I could feel the tension slowly fading away. I walked down the deserted street thinking about what lay ahead of me. I didn't know what would happen tomorrow, in a week, in a year. But I did know that I didn't want to be who I was anymore. I wanted to be stronger, better, happier. I went back to the motel, lay down on the bed, and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe freely. Even though this was just the beginning, there was still a lot of pain ahead, a lot of hardship, but I knew I could do it, because I no longer had a choice, because I deserved better. It had been a few days since I had left our home. Life at the motel had become familiar, albeit temporary. Every morning I woke up thinking that today was a new step forward, a new opportunity for a fresh start. But along with that came the realization of how much there was to do, how much there was to experience. The meeting with the lawyer was surprisingly calm. He explained to me all the stages of the divorce process, told me about my rights and how best to deal with the common property. I listened to him, nodding, but inside I felt as if this wasn't happening to me, like it was about some other person whose life was falling apart. But it was me, and I needed to deal with it. After the meeting, I headed to a cafe nearby. Sitting at a table with a cup of coffee, I allowed myself to think about the future for the first time in a long time. About what would happen after all the formalities were settled. I realized that I couldn't live in a motel forever. I needed to find a new place to live, a new job, a new life. But how do you start when everything you knew has crumbled to dust? I pulled out a notepad and started writing down my thoughts. A plan. I needed a plan. First thing was to find an apartment. Then I had to figure out a job. I'd wanted to change careers for a long time, but I'd always put it off until later. Now it was later. I couldn't put it off any longer. I wrote a list of things to do and felt a small sense of control come back to me. In the evening, I returned to the motel and began looking for housing options. Apartments, rooms, even houses. I considered everything that could be my new home. I realized it would be a temporary solution, but I needed a place where I could feel safe, where I could start over. The next day, I went to see one of the apartments. It was small but cozy, with large windows through which the sun shone. I stood in the center of the living room and imagined what my new life could look like here. An empty room, blank walls, but there was a beauty to it. It was a blank canvas on which I could paint something new. I made arrangements with the landlord and moved in a couple days later. My belongings fit into a few boxes, but that didn't bother me. I knew that material things were not the main thing. The important thing was inside me, and I had to find a way to rebuild what was broken. The first few days in the new apartment were hectic. I was arranging things, buying the necessary furniture, organizing the space. This distracted me from thoughts of the past, but at night, when I was alone, they returned. Memories, regrets, unanswered questions. I tried not to think about her, but it was impossible. She was part of me, part of my history, and I had to find a way to live with that. One evening, I decided to go out for a walk. The new neighborhood was quiet with a small park nearby. I walked down the alley, breathing in the fresh air, and suddenly realized that I felt calm for the first time in a long time. Not happy, but calm. It was the beginning. I sat down on a bench and looked up at the stars. They seemed so far away, so out of reach. But there was some hope in their light. Hope that even after the darkest night, there is a dawn. I didn't know how long it would take to heal, to learn to trust again, to find myself. But I knew I had time, and I was going to use it wisely. I got home, lay down on my bed, and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could look into the future without fear. Even though it was uncertain, even though there were still many challenges ahead. But I knew I could handle it, because I no longer had a choice, because I deserved better, and I was going to prove it. To myself. To her. To the world. It had been a few months since I had started a new life. The apartment I had rented was slowly settling in. The walls were covered with photos I had taken during my lonely walks around the city. I bought some plants to add some life to the interior. Every day I tried to do something to remind me that I was moving forward, even if the steps were small. Work was starting to pick up too. I got a job at a small company that did design. It wasn't something I had done before, but I enjoyed learning new things. The coworkers were friendly, and I slowly started to feel like part of the team. That was important. I didn't want to be alone anymore. But the past was still making itself felt. Some nights I would wake up dreaming about her. Her laugh, her eyes, her voice. I tossed and turned in bed, trying to chase those images away, but they came back again and again. I knew I couldn't just forget. But I also knew I couldn't let it rule my life. One evening, as I was driving home, I got a call from my lawyer. He informed me that all the divorce papers were ready and all that was left to do was sign them. I made an appointment for the next day. When I hung up the phone, I felt strangely relieved. This was the final step to finally close this chapter of my life. The next day, I met with the lawyer at his office. He handed me a folder with documents and explained what needed to be done. I signed the papers without feeling any emotion. It was just a formality. When I left the office, I felt as if a huge weight had fallen off my shoulders. I was now free. But fate, as always, had a surprise in store for me. In the evening of the same day, when I was sitting at home watching a movie, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting guests, so I was surprised. Opening the door, I saw her. She stood on the threshold, pale and nervous. In her hand, she held the very same engagement ring. I didn't know what to say. We stood in silence, looking at each other. Finally, she spoke. She said that she had been thinking about me all this time, that she realized how wrong she had been, that she wanted to take it all back. Her voice shook, and I could see how hard it was for her to speak. But I felt nothing but emptiness. I politely asked her to come in. We sat down in the living room and she began to talk. About how she was sorry, how she realized she had lost the most important thing in her life. She talked about love, about how we could fix everything. But I listened to her like it was a monologue from a movie. I felt nothing. When she was done, I picked up the ring she'd put on the table and looked at it. It was the same as the day I'd put it on her finger. But now it felt foreign to me. I put it back on the table and said that I couldn't take it back, that we had changed, that I had changed, and that I needed to move on. She cried as she left. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling a shiver go through my whole body. This was hard, but it felt right. I woke up the next day with a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt free. I knew there was a lot of work to do on myself, a lot of new challenges ahead, but I was ready for them. I stepped outside and breathed in the fresh morning air. The city was waking up, and I felt myself waking up with it. I walked down the street, not knowing exactly where I was going, but knowing that it was the way forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that the future could be bright, that I could be happy, that I deserved to be. I walked into the cafe, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window. The sun was shining in my face, and I smiled. It was the beginning of a new life, and I was ready to live it the way I wanted to live it. Without looking back at the past, only forward.